Welcome to the Williamsburg Council Work Session of November 8th. Ms. Felica, if you'd call the roll, please.
Mr. Rogers.
Here.
Ms. Ramsey.
Here.
Mayor Pons.
Here.
Vice Mayor Dent.
Here.
Mr. Maslin.
Here.
Okay, first on our agenda is items for city council meetings of November 10th. Mr. Trivette.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. So we have 3 public hearings on Wednesday. The first has to do with the Archaeological Center at Colonial Williamsburg, and 2 items that need to be changed there, zoning items. And then we have our first handling of the issue of cannabis in the city. This is going to deal primarily with medical sale, a zoning issue again. And then the last public hearing is creation of the Historic Triangle Recreational Facilities Authority, which is a step in the direction of seeing the sports center complex be constructed. Under unfinished business, we'll talk a little bit more about the city's participation in the statewide opioid abatement fund process, a resolution. And then under new business, we have a budget amendment for the capital improvement plan. We have the end of the year spending plan for the Williamsburg James City County School System. And we have a presentation by Anlar having to do with how to handle preschool versus elementary school construction. And then the last item on the agenda is the consideration and adoption of the city's legislative agenda.
Any questions for the city manager? No? Okay, so it takes us now to public comment portion of the meeting, which is an opportunity for anybody that would like to come forward to speak to city council about anything that's on their mind. Seeing none, I'll close that public comment section and move on to background presentations. And first we have the presentation and discussion of the Williamsburg Area Transit Authority Rapid Routing and Electrification Study. I saw Drew on the memo, but I see Carolyn popped up.
I'm just getting the screen up.
All right.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. So our first presentation today has to do with the some changes to WADA's service plan. As you all know, part of our goals, initiatives, and outcomes has been, at least for the last 2 sessions of GIOs, improvements to WADA, particularly considering frequency of service as it relates to the urban core, the city Williamsburg routes. In addition to that desire, we have also had Colonial Williamsburg Foundation that desires to change its relationship to WADA in terms of how it interfaces for the service they provide. No changes of service, just how they interface. And the fact that the buses that we use in the historic district are at end of life. They're compressed natural gas. The infrastructure that services those buses is at end of life. And so it's a good time for us to sort of step back and take a holistic look at the services that we provide inside the city and how we relate to the counties in terms of frequency and electrification. So we challenged WADA to proceed. We participated in the funding of a study with WADA to look at both those issues, rapid routing and electrification. And today we have Scudder Wag with us, who is going to lead us through the results of their study and hopefully take this forward to the next steps, which we'll talk about at the end of the presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me well?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. I'm going to share my desktop and hope you all can see that. The presentation I'm sharing with you was shared in your agenda packet, although this is slightly updated. Thank you for your time. Thank you, Andrew, for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be with you all this afternoon. Andrew told you a good deal about why already, so I won't go too much further than to say that this is a great opportunity to take a bit more holistic look at how you can take your system and improve it significantly, particularly given that your current system, when you look at what WADA is doing and what CWF is doing, is somewhat disintegrated or not integrated and not particularly seamless. You have a significant level of density in much of the city of Williamsburg, excuse me, and relatively high density downtown and in the William and Mary campus. You have significant density along the Richmond Road corridor. Midtown High Street in particular is a significant node, and out to Newtown. And then you have obviously significant key tourism drivers on the edge of town, the outlets, Busch Gardens, Water Park, Great Wolf Lodge, so many potential destinations that could be significantly improved with more frequent service. Because one of the key challenges of your existing system, as has already been indicated by previous requests for more frequency, is that the frequency of service is so low. And that's one of the things I want to emphasize so much. In a region where the distances between places is not necessarily that long, the speed of service is not necessarily the critical factor. It is how long you have to wait for a vehicle to show up, because that is a thing that is unique to transit compared to driving or other options. And right now, this map is color-coded by the frequency of service. All the maps I show you will be color-coded by frequency. Red meaning every 15 minutes or better, dark blue every 30 minutes, and light blue every 60 minutes. And I want to emphasize, you can think about a route that's coming every 60 minutes as kind of like there's a gate at the end of your driveway that only opens once an hour. And if you have to be at work at 8 a.m., you best be in your car ready to go because the gate's only opening once an hour. So if you want to significantly improve the ability for people to get somewhere in a reasonable amount of time, frequency is really the thing to do. But that requires an investment in significant potential investment in operating more service, which is about both buses, but mostly about hiring the staff to drive the vehicles, maintain the vehicles. And that is an ongoing cost year after year. That is the really significant thing that you have to be prepared to do to significantly change the situation. The other factor that has arisen as we've been working on this is the desire to have clean, quiet vehicles, particularly in the historic core of of Williamsburg, and that has pushed us in the direction of recommending electric vehicles. Battery electric vehicles are much quieter than any other vehicles out there today. Significant improvement in ride quality for people on the vehicle and people on the street. No localized emissions, obviously, from the vehicle, and generally lower overall emissions. The overall emission profile depends on where you get your electricity, and thankfully electricity in Virginia is slightly cleaner than average relative to the US. But it can also be an important marketing tool in differentiating your service. And particularly services like what you're doing in the historic core of Williamsburg. There are a few challenges that come with electric vehicles. They're slightly higher cost, on average 20 to 30% more expensive up front. A good portion of that can be offset with federal and state grants in particular. There is the need for investment in charging infrastructure. Again, a lot of that can be offset with federal, state, and utility grants. The more challenging thing, and the reason why this is valuable to think about this now as you're thinking about changing a lot of your operations and service, is electric vehicles do not have the same range. You fill a CNG bus or a diesel bus with fuel at the beginning of the day, there is no concern it's going to run out of fuel. But battery electric buses don't have the same range today that traditional buses do. So it requires some careful thinking in the operations planning, route design for where you can put chargers to keep vehicles running all day. That may mean in some cases things like overhead charging infrastructure like you see on the left from an electric vehicle operating in New York City. And just to give you a flavor for the look and feel of these vehicles, the upper right is a Dash Alexandria, Virginia bus. Been on the road for about a few months now. And then Washington, DC circulator vehicle, which is a Proterra bus. All of these examples here are shown are 40-foot buses, and we are recommending going with 40-foot vehicles primarily because those have the longest range. Because they're larger, they can put larger batteries in these vehicles. So a bit about what does this mean in terms of changing service. So today, we're recommending a 4-phase rollout of improved service. The first phase would be bringing CWF service under the WADA umbrella directly operated and bringing the CWF circulator route to touch the transportation center so that there's a little bit more of a seamless connection between all of the transit services you have. And also revising the Route 14 trolley to extend all the way to Monticello Marketplace and connect to the transportation center, again, to give you a bit more seamless connection across all of your transit services in the city and across the region. This is a relatively small change, but it does give you a relatively big bang for the buck, about a 10% increase in jobs reachable. This map on the left is basically showing you where can people reach more jobs in 45 minutes of travel time. The darker areas meaning more jobs are reachable. And you see this would increase jobs reachable for a few parts along Richmond Road, but also out into the Monticello corridor in particular, and some portions of the Richmond Road corridor. And these charts on the right show you the change in the number of people who would have access to frequent service in red, or 30-minute service in light and dark blue, or 60-minute service in lighter blue. This first phase would have just a tiny increase, or relatively small increase in the number of people who have access to 30-minute service. Phase 2 is the bigger step in the short term. This would mean every 15-minute service on that Route 14 trolley coming from the transportation center in the downtown core out Richmond Road and along Ironbound to Newtown and Monticello. So that'd be every 15-minute service connecting a lot of dense destinations in the city and out into James City County. It would also adjust the CWF route, which is called number 15 on here, to provide mostly two-way service from a likely new parking facility on the eastern end of the historic core, circulating around via Francis, Newport, and Henry to the transportation center. It would also include improved frequency of service on Route 3, which serves some significant pockets of poverty in the city. And that would provide a much improved connection along Capitol Landing and Merrimack to grocery stores and also to the transportation center to connect folks along that corridor into downtown, into all of the connections that are possible from the transportation center. This phase is dependent on getting the electric vehicles to run the two red lines on here, the 14 and the 15. It's also dependent on this parking facility and the changes in that operation of CWF. So likely would be early 2023 if implementation could be started very soon, but that's also, again, dependent on getting the vehicles in hand, because it does take about 12 to 18 months to get the new vehicles in hand. This would have a really big increase in jobs reachable in 45 minutes, a 35% increase for the average person served by WADA service today. So that's a really dramatic increase in people's potential to get to jobs, both for jobs they want to hold, but also jobs that are representative of all sorts of destinations, because jobs represent not just places people go to work, but places people want to go for shopping, for medical services, for college, community college, et cetera. And you see in this chart to the bottom right, the significant increase in the numbers of people who would have access to 15-minute service. In the existing network, fewer than 1,000 people in Williamsburg have access to every 15-minute service. And now you'd be talking about nearly 5,000 people in the city of Williamsburg having access to every 15-minute transit service, which would be an enormous improvement. And you see those changes also for James City County and a little bit in York County. Phase 3 would be a continuation of frequency increases on the two busiest routes in the WADA system, Route 1, which serves the Pocahontas corridor and goes down to Busch Gardens, again, improving access to some major tourist destinations and all of the various hotels and commercial activity along that corridor. And on Route 2, which serves the Richmond Road corridor all the way up to the Walmart, premium outlets, and many other destinations along that corridor. We're not proposing electrification of those two routes at this time, although longer term you could look at that as an option. And this would, again, building on all of the previous improvements, lead to an even larger increase in jobs reachable in 45 minutes, now a 57% increase in jobs that are reachable in 45 minutes for the average person served by WADA. And you start to see a big increase in the numbers of people who can reach 30-minute or better services in the city, in James City County, and in York County. And then phase 4 would be to convert the Route 8, the William and Mary service today, into a frequent corridor service every 15 minutes and extend it so it went to the transportation center and so it would go to the High Street area at Ironbound and Middle Road. That would significantly improve access to people to and from the William and Mary campus and to a lot of destinations in between. And it would also turn this every 15-minute number 14 route that's serving Richmond Road, Ironbound, and Monticello into a through route that goes all the way through the transportation center to Francis Street and to the historic core. That would make the service simpler for everyone as a through routed service across town. And this in total compared to the existing would get you to a 65% increase in jobs reachable in 45 minutes. And an even greater increase in the numbers of people who are near 15-minute service. Now over 6,000 people in Williamsburg and almost 6,000 people in James City County who would have access to every 15-minute service. So those are a lot of really valuable benefits you get out of this investment. What is this investment? What does it cost? Each phase, we've calculated the approximate cost increase in cost for operating the service, and then I'll go through the capital cost in just a moment. So phase 1, implementing that consolidation of the CWF service and running it to the transportation center. There's a kind of a two-part explanation here of our calculation of cost. One is there's an underlying baseline cost increase that we know is coming. WADA knows it probably has to raise driver wages given the economy and the current shortage of drivers. And that increase alongside the associated benefit costs and so on is likely to mean a 25% increase in the wage cost portion of their budget, which would be about a $622,000 increase in the cost to localities. With that plus the consolidation of the CWF services would mean about a $1.92 million overall additional cost. But we are assuming in collaboration with CWF that they would continue to contribute to the service so that the net cost would be $1.22 million to localities for that phase 1. Phase 2, where you start to see a big increase in the frequency of service with that Route 14 implementation. That implementation would mean a total of about $2.68 million a year in operating costs over existing, relative to the existing cost, $2.68 million. Phase 3, when you turn up the frequency of routes 1 and Route 2, serving the Pocahontas corridor and the Richmond Road corridor, combined with all of the previous phases means a $3.39 million per year additional cost. And then phase 4, at this phase, with the through routing of the 14 trolley route into the historic core route, we're assuming at that point there would be a slight reduction in CWF contribution to $500,000 a year, as there would be less flexibility in how the service to the historic core is adjusted based on demand, and it would be a more flat organization of the service. With that adjustment and the increase in frequency of the 8, the total cost would be $4.27 million above existing. So how would those costs potentially be distributed to the 3 localities that make up WADA? There's an important thing to note here about the way you do it today versus how you might do it in the future. In the past, operating cost for each locality has basically been calculated as what's the cost of service that WADA is providing minus all of the various revenue streams from federal, state, advertising, fares, et cetera. What's the remainder? And then how that is distributed is by what we call route miles. These 3 examples down here showing a red frequent route, a blue every 30-minute route, and a green every 60-minute route. Each of those routes in this example have the same number of route miles because they're the same length. But their actual cost of service is very different because in transit, most cost comes from labor, which tracks with the hours of service provided. And so this example is showing you routes of equal length but different frequencies. A 30-minute route here is actually twice the number of buses and twice the number of hours of service, therefore, as a 60-minute route. So to provide a 15-minute route on the same length of route as a 60-minute route, you need 4 times as much service. You need 4 times as many vehicles, 4 times as much labor cost, effectively. So there's a significant question here about, is using route miles, if you significantly change your network and invest in frequency, the right thing to do? It probably is not. It's probably not the fairest thing to do across all 3 localities. So we have calculated options for how you might distribute this differently in the future. If you continued to use your route mile operating cost and distributed everything by route miles, going out to phase 4 in that total additional cost, you're looking at a distribution that would be 1.4 million for Williamsburg, 2.3 million for James City County, and 1.2 million, 1.27 million for York County. If you did by revenue hour, which is then distributing it by the hours of service in each locality, which is going to vary much more now because the frequency is very different, then that would lead to a distribution of 2.4 million for Williamsburg, 1.8 million for James City County, and 776,000 for York County. And at the top of these tables are some comparisons of the FY20 contribution and the FY 2022 contributions that you have made in the past for comparisons to previous years. You could choose a hybrid approach where you, for example, 50% of your cost is by route mile and 50% is by revenue hour, or you could choose a completely different measure. But if you chose halfway in between, then you'd be talking about a distribution that was 1.9 million for Williamsburg, 2.1 million for James City County, and about 1 million for York County. Lastly, I want to talk a little bit about the costs of capital and electrification. The major capital needs for electrification are the new vehicles, the depot chargers, the chargers that are at the garage that WADA owns off of Pocahontas, and the en-route chargers, the overhead charging infrastructure in the field along a route where vehicles can basically top up their battery tank, so to speak. We propose effectively 2 waves of investment in infrastructure. Wave 1 is to be able to implement both phases 1 and 2, which would require 12 vehicles and 4 depot chargers and 2 en-route chargers. And wave 2 is what would be necessary to implement phase 4, which would be 5 more buses and 2 more depot chargers. The charging approach in wave 1 is that you can run the initial design of the CWF route with just depot chargers. But once you implement routes 14 and 15, as we have in phase 2, you would need an en-route charger in order to ensure your vehicles can complete the work they need to do for the day. There are 4 vehicles that look like good candidates for meeting your needs. They range in price, estimated price of between $830,000 and $930,000 roughly in cost. So if we multiply that out by the total number of vehicles across the entire, both waves, the high-end cost is just under $16 million. Many of these manufacturers will likely be under a standard vehicle contract that the state of Virginia is working out through DRPT. That would make it relatively easy to procure them. That contract's not finalized yet, but we know it is in the works. WADA and others have used the standard state contracts for vehicle purchases in the past, so that would make things much simpler. And for the depot charging, we are recommending 6 depot chargers with that 150 kilowatt hours each. and 2 on-route chargers that are capable of 450 kilowatt hours. You need much higher kilowatt hours for on-route charging because you are usually doing that in 5 or 10 minutes to help give you an extra 20 miles or more of range, and so you need to charge more quickly. The total cost for wave 1 for all of that charging infrastructure we estimate to be about $2.3 million, and for wave 2 about just under $400,000. And so in total, that would come out to just under 16 million for the vehicles and just under $2.7 million for the facilities. However, again, many of these costs can be reduced significantly through FTA's low or no emission program, which covers 85% of costs for buses and 90% for facilities. WADA also has an existing grant that may cover potentially up to 5 or 6 buses and has a 100% federal share, meaning 0% local share. And Dominion Energy has a smart charging infrastructure program that could give you a credit or rebate of up to potentially $500,000 in reducing the cost of the facilities for charging. So the minimum local match expectation and potential local share outcomes look to be about $2.4 million for both wave 1 and wave 2 in total for the electrification infrastructure. Most of that in wave 1 for the multiple depot chargers you need in wave 1 and the on-route chargers and the 6 buses in wave 1. There are a few additional capital costs that would still need to be sorted out. There would need to be some bus stop improvements on Francis Street. There would potentially need to be some adjustments in the pull-offs within the transportation center to make enough space for the number of vehicles that would be coming into the transportation center in the future. And also because one of these on-route chargers would be in the transportation center, and it may, the placement of that may require some additional adjustment to curbs or asphalt in order to make the appropriate space for that. That would require more effort on design to fine tune exactly how much that would cost, although some of it could be done on an interim basis. For example, on the CWF services and the bus stops on Francis Street, for example, until you have a solid figure. So that's our summary of where we are with this as a draft plan for recommendations for improvements to transit and consolidation. And happy to take questions.
Well, thank you, Scudder Wag. Hey, I just wanted to say that name. I think it's pretty cool.
Thank you.
Good presentation, and clearly, you know, you've hit kind of the highlights of some key elements for us, and that's, you know, one is increased frequency, and I think that's been a longstanding complaint about ridership, and you know, with that complaint of frequency and lack of ridership is people who don't use the bus say, oh, the bus is always empty, and so if we can increase ridership and you know, therefore justify the need and the expense, I think that would be a great thing to do. And then electrifying, I think, is, you know, one of our GIOs just to kind of reduce our carbon footprint. In your analysis, did you give any consideration to revenue that would come in with the increased ridership?
No, we have not modeled any potential ridership gain. It is ridership, we would expect ridership to go up with as much of an improvement in frequency. However, predicting ridership is an extremely uncertain thing. As you can see in the pandemic over the last year, ridership in transit traffic has just been incredibly unpredictable. And so we know it's likely you would get more revenue from higher ridership. We also know it's likely you would see some increase in your federal and state funding shares because some of those are dependent on how much service you're running and how much ridership you're getting. We think, though, it's best from a conservative planning standpoint financially to think about this in terms of those things being flat and to be surprised on the upside.
And that makes sense. And I guess then my second question would be, and probably answered the same way, any consideration to the size of vehicles based on the transit route? If a route is, running every 15 minutes, does it have to be a full bus? Could it be a half a bus or whatever that might be called, a smaller vehicle?
So in transit, the 70% of the costs are about labor.
Right.
And so therefore, the vehicle size, particularly when we're talking about electric, the vehicle size makes very, very little difference in the cost of service. So the primary thing you consider in deciding what kind of vehicle to run is usually what's going to be the peak demand, because you want that vehicle to be able to meet the peak demand you're going to see, because that vehicle needs to be out there all day. And for a high frequency service like this, you would hope and anticipate that you're going to have high peak demand. And so you want it to be able to carry a lot of people because it needs to be out there all day. So that's one significant reason to prioritize using the 40-foot vehicle. The secondary reason is for electric vehicles in particular, you have a significantly longer range with a 40-foot vehicle because they can put larger batteries in them. And we want to be sure that these routes and your buses that you have running them are as flexible and reliable as possible long term.
And one last question before I turn it over to Vice Mayor Dent. And I know electric vehicles, it's a growing industry. The technology is every day improving. Any consideration as to how long these vehicles last? Do they last longer than a natural gas bus or diesel bus, or is the life cycle about the same and the cost of maintenance about the same?
The cost of maintenance is definitely lower because there's just far fewer moving parts. Right. The life cycle is frankly still a little bit of an open question because the average life cycle for most buses is around 12 to 15 years. 12 years is the typical cutoff that most agencies use. And most battery electric buses have not been around that long. We do know that a few agencies have had teething issues with some of the newest electric buses in the last 5 years, but that has improved dramatically in just the last year or two. And we have been working internally with some of our partners at other agencies to, for example, with Dash here in Alexandria, which is next door to where I live, they've been trying out a variety of different models. And so we have information from them. We have information from King County and Seattle about the reliability. And that's one of the things we'll definitely be including in the information we share in the final report about what looks like the most reliable vehicles to use.
Good. Thank you so much. Vice Mayor, any questions?
Yeah. Thank you for the presentation. I had a list of questions, but as you went through the presentation, you hit on a number of them. One of the things I did want to follow up on what the mayor touched on was maintenance. And I know when the school system recently rolled out their new electric buses, one thing that was surprising to me is that even though it was an electric bus and the engine compartment looked much different, the weight of that bus was very similar to a diesel bus. Is that true with these transit buses as well?
Yes, the weight is similar. Sometimes it can actually be higher because battery weight batteries are quite heavy. The chemical structure of the batteries and the structure of the battery itself in terms of the materials needed to maintain safety and all of that, they're hefty. Oh, did I lose you all?
No, you're still there?
Yeah, I thought
There was a
I'm
glitch.
sorry.
So along those lines, also on the, I know through the school's new electric buses, one of the things that helps them reduce maintenance is their manufacturer of the batteries provides a lifetime warranty on the battery. So if they have issues with the batteries, they're immediately replaced. Is that something that's also available
So I think it's a little bit variable by manufacturer, but I'd have to double check on the details. But I know at least that most of these manufacturers have warranties of 5 to 7 years on the batteries. Some of them may be a little shorter than that. I'd have to pull up the details and possibly talk to our electrification expert. Paulo Nunez Ueno is our electrification expert. He can make it today. I apologize. But yeah, most of these manufacturers have a significant warranty on the batteries.
Okay. And then when you talk about it's difficult to predict ridership gain, has there been an opportunity for the public to provide input? Is it how many people are interested in more frequent routes that they would use the system based on the increased frequency?
So we have not done any particular specific outreach on this plan and how many people would find the service useful. But I know we have worked in communities across Virginia and across the country on plans and processes that have led to more frequent service. And the basic ridership recipe is putting frequent service along dense, linear, walkable corridors. And that has been extremely successful in Richmond, where we redesigned their network that was launched in 2018. Here in Alexandria, next door to me, where their new network launched in September, and they've seen some ridership gains from it. And in Houston, where we redesigned their bus network. That's the basic ridership recipe, and the recipe basically works irrespective of how people might respond to a survey, because most people just want to get where they're going in a reasonable amount of time. And that's a very fundamental reality for almost everyone. And the basic ridership recipe is putting that frequent service where you have the most people and the most jobs and the most activity. And even if we don't have survey data to prove it, we know very, very clearly from many, many studies of productivity and frequency across the country that is the likely outcome.
Okay, and one last question. You talked about the number of buses. What would you anticipate at the end of all 4 phases, the increase in the number of jobs for WADA?
The increase in the number of jobs or operators working
Right,
for
operators or maintenance. I'm assuming you'll retrain the current maintenance staff to address the electric buses.
Yeah, there would need to be some retraining of existing staff. There would need to be additional operators to operate the new service, or the expanded and more frequent services. I do not have a estimate on that at this point. And we can rough that out for you if you would like a number. We can definitely give you an estimate on the number of additional operators you might need. The precise number of additional maintenance staff or other staff you might need is more variable. It's not as easy to give you a definitive number on.
Okay, thank you.
Basil?
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. Extending Route 14 is great, especially with the access to jobs there. And last time I looked, the closest Amazon lockers are actually at that Rite Aid on the other side of that Target, so I can imagine that could be quite popular. What about, so you're sort of showing us getting to the job. Were you able to study any limitations in terms of the start of the journey by the workers from their home, in terms of how well do we have service to actually pick them up and get them to the transportation center if that's where they need to switch?
So if I understand what you're asking about the ability of people to connect to the rest of the system?
Yeah, from their home.
So the improvements in the 14 and the 8, the improvements of frequency to the 1 and the 2 and the 3, they all serve some, areas both of jobs and of residences, and so would reach a lot of people, both where they live or near where they live, and in order to connect them to all these places. The other routes in the system, the 5, the 6, and others, reach further out with less frequency, but reach further out into the region and would provide some connectivity to all of these more frequent routes. In transit, the vast majority of people who are reaching service are almost always walking. And so in looking at some of these redesigned routes and some of these improved routes, we have identified a couple of locations on these changed routes where crosswalks, sidewalks, some other kinds of improvements would make it significantly easier for people to be able to reach these services. I believe we looked at a couple of locations along Capitol Landing and along Merrimack for that Route 3 improvement, where some targeted sidewalks or crosswalks would make a significant difference in people's ability to reach the service. So we have noted that. Some of those would be for the city, some of those might be for VDOT, some of those might be for the counties to make improvements on. So we have identified a couple of locations in this process to help improve that access.
So another question. So before we've discussed WADA being underutilized by William & Mary College students. Did you, as part of your research, did you actually talk to any William & Mary students as to what would improve their ridership?
We did not talk to students, but we did have a lot of interaction with William & Mary staff as we were looking at these possibilities. They relayed that many students find the existing 14 incredibly useful and would very likely respond very positively to this increase in frequency on the 14 and the extension of it to Monticello Marketplace. And that is probably one of the highest priority things that they have heard from students in terms of their desire for improved service.
So one of the areas on 14 which improved frequency would really help is, you know, we've got Plumeri Park and the Martin Family Stadium where the baseball, soccer, and lacrosse games are, and many of those are at night. Would WADA have the ability to flex schedule so that they could actually maintain a good frequency during the night games?
I believe we are presuming that this Route 14, and I have my colleague, Ricky Anguera, I should mention, he's actually on the phone as well. Ricky, can you remind me the frequency of service, how late it goes on this assumed 14?
Give me 1 second, I'll check right here.
I believe it would run pretty late into the evening. It might drop back to 30-minute service around 7 or 8 p.m. But we could certainly look at options of extending the frequency later in the evening. And if it's a function of just on select days, like game days, I think that's certainly something you can work through with WADA. Okay,
no, that'd be good. So, go ahead.
I was going to say the 14, we have it right now up until 10 p.m.
Running every 15 minutes?
Right, yes.
Okay.
Every day. And yep.
No, that's great. So what's your, looking at your phases again, if you were to sort of filter in access to our safety net medical facilities, Old Town Medical, Dental, Lackey Free Clinic, Colonial Behavioral Health, how much are we showing improvements in terms of accessing medical facilities like that?
I do not have a really clear answer at this particular moment, but what we can actually do is these maps that I showed you that show the change in access to jobs, we can do a calculation that's called an isochrone, which is a comparative map showing you how far you can get from any of those medical facilities today by transit in 45 minutes and how far you'd be able to get with all of these improvements. So we can run a couple of those examples to help answer that question and help you see the improvement.
Yeah, and when you're looking at that, I didn't hear any mention about paratransit expansion. So one of the limitations, I think, on paratransit is it has to be within, what, a quarter of a mile of a route. What's that? 3/4 of a mile? So by expanding our routes, more people could qualify for paratransit. What's the impact on cost for that?
So these routes in phase 4, none of these go any farther outward. None of these expand that 3/4 mile area, because the 14, for example, going out to Monticello Marketplace, that's served by Route 5 today. And in all of these changes, the Route 5 would actually be slightly adjusted here to serve Strawberry Plains more fully and with two-way service. So none of these actually change that 3/4 mile service area. So it would not increase the area where people are eligible for paratransit.
Okay, now on the cost models you were talking about, would it make sense to have a hybrid approach where the route miles are used for allocating costs for the buses, for the capital equipment, since that seems to be more related to distance, and then operating costs for labor?
So that's an option. Some agencies I've worked with will allocate costs, a portion of costs based on revenue hours, because that's how labor is the biggest cost there, and so they will allocate 50 to 70% based on that factor, and then allocate another portion, maybe 20 or 30% based on miles, route miles or revenue miles. A route mile is just the length of the Route 14 as a route, versus revenue miles is the total number of miles each bus drives over that route. And then another factor called peak fleet, which is, I think, what you're getting at in terms of the capital cost of vehicles. So there's a number of different formula you could use to approach the challenge of distributing costs. And we're certainly here to help you and WADA and your partners think through those. It's ultimately a choice of political choice here about how you all feel it's most appropriate to distribute the costs.
Yeah. So final question about driver wages. So how do we, right now, I think we've got a report coming up this week that says we're short maybe 27 school bus drivers. So have you seen in other communities where there's been a successful partnership between transit and school bus drivers that, maybe it's the same training program, and so we don't get this competition going back and forth?
I am not aware personally of any examples of school districts and transit agencies coordinating on that, but I can ask around.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for the presentation. I just have a couple questions. Most of mine, as was said earlier, have been addressed already. One thing you mentioned that there's a lot of federal funding available, particularly for buses and for the charging stations. Is that something that's fairly assured, or would Williamsburg and WADA have to compete with other municipalities, particularly those who are considering converting to electric buses at this time?
So we know WADA has in hand a significant.
The one that you mentioned, right? The 100%.
Yes. So they have in hand about a $6 million grant that's 100% federal share that they can very likely use for electric vehicle purchases. So that would cover potentially half of these purchases. The low or no emission program is competitive, but it's a program that's getting a whole lot of additional funding out of this new Senate infrastructure bill. So if you come in early, you have a fairly decent shot, I'd say, at getting funding through that program. If for some reason you did not, federal dollars can still be used for a 50% share of most any vehicle purchase. And state grants often cover another 20 to 30% or more of just about any vehicle purchase that a transit agency makes. So there are backup options that may require slightly higher local matches, but are still have relatively low local match requirements.
Okay, thank you. And on your map, say for phase 2, where you have proximity to transit, so for that, I think this goes to Mr. Maslin's question about access to the route. So I assume each of those dots represents a certain amount of population.
So on the left here, what this map is telling us is in the darkest areas on this map that someone who lives there or works there from that point can reach about 4,000 to 8,000 additional jobs, for example, from this point off of, say, Francis and Waller. Or from this point up here near Ironbound and Middle Road, you could reach 2,000 to 4,000 additional jobs in 45 minutes. So if you lived in that area, that would be, you would see a substantial gain in the number of jobs you could reach in 45 minutes from that point. So this doesn't represent population, this represents that increase in access that you would experience from that location. And you can think of that as a proxy for the improvement in your mobility and access to all sorts of things from that particular part of the city or the county.
And when you've mentioned that other areas, I guess particularly in Alexandria, has increased frequency, that they've seen an increase in ridership, is that across the board, i.e. those who also have cars decide to use public transit, or only for those who do not have cars?
I don't think there is a really easy way to distinguish for certain at a level of detail where I could say it is definitely, X% more people with cars and X% more people without cars. I know anecdotally many people in Richmond who had previously not used transit, who began using transit because it was much more frequent on a lot of major corridors after redesign and the significant improvement in frequency along corridors like Broad Street and Chamberlain Avenue and Hull Street and others. But we do also see in many cases lower income people or people from without cars making more trips, or making trips that they may have previously asked for a ride, or some other factor, because the transit is just significantly more useful and can actually get them somewhere in a reasonable amount of time now.
Well, obviously for someone who does not have a car, having frequent public transit is a great improvement in quality of life overall, not just for their job access, but as you mentioned earlier, grocery stores, retail, just visiting friends and family too. So I understand that.
Absolutely. It's very frustrating to walk out of the grocery store with a bunch of groceries and have just missed an hourly bus.
Right, right. Particularly if you've got ice cream in your pack.
Yeah, exactly.
So thank you very much. I don't have any other questions.
Scooter, thank you so much for this presentation. This is really helpful, particularly what I think you might have called ISO maps, but this visualization of how each phase changes and the jobs that are accessible has been fantastic. So I appreciate you and Director Trogdon working together on this. Couple of questions. The increase in cost based on the 25% increase in pay looks like it was associated with phase 1, 582,000. But as we increase ridership and potentially add longer routes in, will we need to add more actual bus drivers in phase 3 and 4? In other words, would that increase in pay end up going up for the localities?
So what we did in order to assure that we were capturing that higher baseline cost of pay is that we worked with WADA to get their detailed budget of how much is going to wages and fringe benefits versus other things. And we increased that by 25%. And then we took that cost factor of the total cost of service with that potential increase in wages. And we know that that would yield $622,000 in additional cost localities. But most importantly, we took that total cost then of operating service with that additional wage increase and divided it by the total amount of service you have now to get an estimate of what is the marginal cost of every additional revenue hour of service you run.
That was
Which,
it.
and that's $83 per hour
Yeah,
with that additional
maintained.
wage.
Right, I noticed between the phases too that maintained, so
Yeah.
that's good to know. Okay.
Now, an important note here is we are calculating everything in 2022 dollars. So, phase 4 may not be implemented for, 4 or 5 years from now, and general inflation will raise that overall. So this is in 2022 dollars. So inflation will naturally raise some of these costs. But if we're talking about comparisons to today, to your cost today, if you were able to implement phase 4 tomorrow, that's what the cost would be.
Okay. Well, speaking of inflation, and I'll first say with the virtual presentation, I'm not sure where to look. So I'm going to look at the camera up here, but sorry if you see me looking somewhere else. It mentioned at the end of phase 2, I think it would be the beginning of 2023, in which we're able to electrify 2 routes and see a 15-minute distance between the trolley route, which is just the William and Mary and sort of downtown community. At phase 3 and phase 4, was there an implementation going more frequency for those others building on top of phase 2? Is that something that could be done by 2024, or is it more the appetite of councils in our neighboring localities to reach the additional phases?
It's mostly your appetite for the additional cost. The phase 3, improving the frequency of routes 1 and 2, you have the vehicles today to do that because you run 30-minute service at peak times normally. So it's just a function of additional operators for additional shifts and then running that service every 30 minutes all day long. And then phase 4, the primary constraint there is the secondary wave of electric vehicle purchases, and then the additional operating cost and your appetite for that cost.
Okay. Well, this has been great. Thank you for the presentation. Those are all my questions. I guess just say it's nice to have seen this presentation. So what feels like shortly after the GIOs a year, given that it almost checks 2 boxes in that, I hear all the time people find the WADA buses are easily trackable, but it was just if only they were more frequent, which is great. But also with the electrification, transportation, something like 29% of greenhouse gas emissions. So being able to electrify some of the routes that are also in our downtown area to make them more silent would be fantastic. Thank you, Scooter, and to your firm and to Director Trogdon as well. That's all for me.
Thank you for the presentation this afternoon. Forward to what's next.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. So next steps on this will be Mr. Wag will present this to the WADA board. The WADA board will consider what they like and don't like about what's being proposed and include that in their budgetary decisions moving into the next fiscal years, ultimately impacting how much the localities have to provide and support. Part of that process will be making sure that we've accurately captured what grants are available and how they might impact those costs, doing our best job to estimate ridership, and also to adjust that relationship with Clinton Williamsburg Foundation. So you can expect that this will come back in the form of a budget request.
Always comes down to the money.
It sure does.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. Okay, so we'll move on to item B on the agenda, presentation and discussion of the Affordable Housing Workgroup report. Mr. Trivette.
Try and find Okay, so another GIO item was the formation of the Affordable Housing Workgroup to work on the issue, the challenge of affordable housing in Williamsburg. And so we have completed that effort, and before we get too deep into it, I just want to say thank you to the work group members. They put in a lot of time and effort into this product, and I think it's evident in what's before you tonight. They did have the advantage of learning from Neighborhood Balance, and so we made some changes to how we operate work groups and of course, in how we represent the final outcomes. So I think that also helped to inform this process. So the report that you have in front of you tonight is the result of the work group's effort over the last many months as we wrestled with a very difficult topic that definitely impacts most communities across the country at this point, particularly those with a high quality of life like Williamsburg. So I'm just going to take a few minutes, especially given how late we already are into the evening, and walk you through some of the process and the outcomes without going into tremendous detail, because obviously you have the information in front of you and you can digest it at your leisure. But what we've got here is the work group members over there on the left, and again, thank you for your time. On the right represents sort of the first major target that we set for the work group, which is to consider income categories. Now, we did that for a couple of reasons. Number one is we needed to set income categories for Williamsburg in terms of what work we were going to try to do, and also establish what areas we were trying to impact. We also wanted to have this discussion to make sure that everybody on the work group was operating from the same level of understanding in terms of what the income categories are and how they relate to each other. From there, we immediately, I think it was actually the very first meeting, decided that one of the things we needed to do was establish clear and definable targets to measure success by. And that was a common trait in many of the plans that we reviewed later in the process. So we contracted with Dr. Stafford, who has done many of our housing studies in the past, to update the current housing study for the city of Williamsburg, as well as the one that she had done for the region. And we asked her to add to that something that she had not done before, and that was to do projections of need in each of the income categories based on a statistical analysis of demographic and population data provided by the Weldon Cooper Center. And so that's what's represented on this page, probably the most important takeaway. And so you've got an assessment of need in both the current time frame as well as 2040 planning horizon. I think what people are most surprised by when they take the time to digest this information is that there is significant need in the higher income categories and the lowest income category, and there is not significant need in the middle section of income categories. And I think that when we say the words affordable housing, or even to some extent workforce housing, those are the categories that people envision that we're talking about. And so we want to take just a minute to illustrate how this functions together. If you look at these charts, you see the red numbers indicating need at the top and the bottom of the list. What happens is those buyers in those categories, as they cannot find product that meets their criteria for affordability, they buy down and they buy up, forcing those middle categories where there's currently a surplus to have less and less available to those earners. And so you really create deficits in all of the categories. So as we think about strategies, it's important to understand the needs, but at the same time keep in context that the deficits are so great in some of these categories that there's not enough supply overall. And so as we think about strategies, we don't need to be focused on improving just one segment. There really needs to be a broad spectrum approach.
Mr. Trivette, can I interrupt you? Help me understand, for example, when we look at the extremely low income household in the current housing stock, you've identified, in the reports, 205 available units. What does that number really mean? I mean, obviously there's more than 205 units. Are we talking single family only? Are we talking multifamily?
So this is across all unit types, and available units are units that are meeting that income category inside the city only, right? So only inside the city. And so while it seems like 205 is a low number, keep in mind that that is the extremely low income category, and there are very few of those units available.
Gotcha. But even as you move to the moderate income, there's 644 units. So if I added up all the available units in yellow, That would be the total number of units in the city?
No,
so-
because not all income categories are represented. So you get into those that other household category, and there's a whole host of price points way above that.
Thank you.
All right, so from setting targets, we move to talking about what the group thought the best top possible concepts or strategies might be to help address these needs. And so we looked at plans from all over the state. We even looked at some outside the state to identify best practices in the area of affordable housing. And obviously, looking at those different localities doesn't always inform what we can do in Williamsburg, given our special needs. But it's certainly important to understand what the successful strategies have been. We also looked at report design and layout and how they presented the information from those plans to help inform how we would relate that to Williamsburg. Ultimately, that work resulted in a list of over 80 affordable housing strategies or initiatives to consider, which is a lot. And so the group began the hard process of deciding which ones were most relevant to Williamsburg. As we did that, there were 13 that obviously came to the top of that consideration. At the same time, we thought that it was very important for the work group to prioritize a select few for the council to focus on, at the same time acknowledging that all 13 of those recommendations are valuable and probably provide excellent impact to the problem. So the report is divided sort of on the left side of this slide and on the right side of the slide. On the left side, you have the 5 focus areas, and on the right-hand side, you have the 8 other additional initiatives that should be considered. I think that it's important to point out that, this is a similar voting process that we use with Neighborhood Balance, but we did do it twice with the Affordable Housing Work Group. The first time, we provided very little instruction in terms of how to vote and what to consider. And then the second time, we had a group discussion about what might be important. And that particularly related to the time frame for implementation, as well as how many units might be created by the initiative. And so this represents the outcome of the second vote. So moving into the solutions or strategies, we are going to focus on the top 5 here. The first one is hotel to affordable housing conversion. This is a topic that should be familiar to the City Council. We've talked about this a lot. This is an existing program that has currently exhausted the number of units available to it that allow existing hotel stock that's not performing optimally to be considered for conversion to residential, with some restrictions on income, designing them to meet the affordable housing need. The staff at the direction of the work group went back and looked at how many units might be possible for creation with this program. And so what we did is we just looked at hotels that we knew are underperforming in the market and identified 843 units. Now, it's important to understand that that 843 just simply represents the number of rooms, right? So a 1-to-1 conversion. One of the things that the staff would recommend if the City Council wanted to pursue this option is that we refine the ordinance so that it actually encourages, if not requires, additional unit types from studios. And that would ultimately reduce the number of units that could be created as hotels use more and more units to provide 2- and 3-bedroom units on the whole. Each one of these next slides gives you the same information. On the left-hand side, you have the explanation of what the strategy is. At the bottom, you have how does that actually work in Williamsburg. On the right-hand side, you have, again, the same 3 sets of information. At the top, you have implementation, a little bit on what steps might be required and how long it might take to do that work. And then you have the anticipated impact, so the staff's best guess for unit creation or unit preservation. And then at the bottom, again, this is a lesson learned from the neighborhood balance outcome, was providing both the City Council and the community with an explanation of what we consider to be the highest challenges or the biggest obstacles to implementing this policy. So hopefully that's helpful to you as you consider your path forward. Number 2 is triangle redevelopment. Again, this has been a priority of the City Council, and it's timely given that the lifespan, the current useful life of the blatant building has expired, and so it's time for us to start to consider what we're going to do as the next phase of that. In addition, we have the police station project, the library project, all on the horizon, and so the area is ripe for consideration of redevelopment. And when we consider redevelopment, we should consider how we can influence that to create mixed income, mixed use type properties so that we're creating additional affordable housing units. including the redevelopment of the Blayton building itself. And so, again, explanation of how this might work in Williamsburg. The city council has talked about this quite a bit as part of budget discussions and including it in the CIP. Implementation is a bit longer with this one because of the amount of time required to navigate finding a developer to partner with, amassing the funding that the city would need to accomplish the project. Anticipated impact is pretty decent, 200 affordable housing units, and that's probably a modest estimate. And then unit preservation is existing 34 or so units at Blayton. Workforce housing at Waller Mill is number 3, and this one is interesting because what we're suggesting here is the possibility that the city could utilize its existing holdings around the Waller Mill Reservoir in York County to build some workforce housing units. Now, these housing units are a little bit different than what we might find in most neighborhoods. These are designed to be low impact, so they are small in size, usually 1,000 square feet or less, and rely on sustainable energy and other types of initiatives to reduce their impact on the environment. So these are the kinds of houses that you have to know are there in order to find them. This would be designed to meet the workforce housing need, so this would be an expansion of our existing workforce housing program where we own property that's then managed by the housing authority and we place our employees in them. I think that if we did this, we would have the opportunity to expand that program to include other employers in the area, such as the counties or possibly even the school system. So the challenge to the staff was to look at our holdings around the reservoir and identify how many new homes we might be able to build using the existing zoning. So this is not considering changing any of the zoning. This is abiding by all of the regulations that are in place in York County. And we identified 35. So pretty low impact solution here to create 35 units. But one of the advantages to this one is it's direct investment for direct return. So it would have a satisfying outcome. Mixed income, mixed use planning. This is designed to impact the Capitol Landing Road area. So as we move forward, we know that the potential for redevelopment and interest in the development sector in this corridor is going to be high because we're about to redo the road. We have a major investment plan for the sports center, all of which will bring with it new interest in this corridor from 64. So the timing is right to consider changing the design guidelines to encourage the type of design that we're interested in. In this instance, what we're talking about is requiring mixed-use, mixed-income designs. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean second stories. As you can see there, there's an example of everything being on one story, and so the residential is actually behind the commercial in the front. And then implementation, again, fairly quick in terms of implementing the change to the city code, but much longer in terms of actually seeing the impact because you've got to wait on that redevelopment to occur. Pretty decent anticipated impact in terms of unit creation. Again, that's best estimates based on conditions that exist in Capitol Landing Road. And then the last of the focus items is to apply for and receive CDBG rehab grants. And so this is a slightly different approach from the other initiatives. This one is designed to preserve existing affordable housing. So you have housing in the city that is currently aging and in some cases not able to meet the needs of the residents who are also aging. And so what this grant process would allow is for us to do investments in what are considered to be safe, warm, and dry improvements to make those properties more livable and increase their longevity to the current household, which is increasing their preservation as affordable housing units. We've included this one with a pretty decent implementation period, and the reason for that is because CDBG grants are notoriously competitive, and we anticipate that it might take us several years of application to refine the application to the point that we're successful. Additional concepts. So here are the other 8 concepts that the group considered valid and wanted to put before the city council. Number 6 is inclusionary zoning. I think everybody understands the process there of modifying a zoning ordinance to require a certain percentage of redevelopment and new development applications to include mixed income designs. 2-story redevelopment requirement, forcing new development and redevelopment to go to a 2-story solution so that residential could be incorporated in the upper floors. Soft density, eliminating single family only densities. This is a very controversial topic in many localities across the state currently, and would have a hard time fitting into Williamsburg, but certainly would do a lot to reduce the need for additional housing. Affordable accessory units, again, similar type of concept, converting garage apartments into affordable units. Community land trust, this is a pretty simple concept, but it's difficult to apply in that it requires considerable funding. And this is a situation where you form a land trust to purchase the land out from under the properties to reduce the overall cost of entry into the market. Number 11 is impact and linkage fees. So this is a process of assigning new fees to your building permits for residential and commercial applications to accommodate for the increased need for affordable housing. The theory being that that revenue that's generated, which in some cases can be considerable, can be invested in many of the programs that require funding. Next is a loan consortium. That one's pretty self-explanatory, providing a new consortium of loan partners who can provide options for financing. And then the last one is William & Mary Assisted Employee Housing. So encouraging the university to do more with the property that they own to provide employee housing for their employees. And then the last slide is just the final thoughts, tying all of this work back to the vision that the city set for itself of 2040. The key frame from this is thriving residents, and in order to thrive, you have to have affordable housing and optimal health. And so hopefully this has been a productive exercise for you, and we'll have a generative outcome in terms of deciding on what next steps we should pursue. Tonight, there's no direction required. However, similar to neighborhood balance, this would be the recommendation of the work group. And if the council sees fit, then the staff would begin to work on some of these top 5 priorities and prepare to bring recommendations back to city council. Also, as Councilman Rogers said, we're almost at the midway point for this GIO period. We'll be doing the midterm report for you and sort of illustrating where we are on all of those GIOs. And then in the next year, we'll be doing the GIO retreat again, and we'll have the opportunity to look more deeply at the neighborhood balance report as well as the affordable housing report and prioritize the strategies again. I don't want to give you the sense that this is your only bite at the apple, right? And these are not meant to be recommendations that sit on the shelf, but they are meant to generate thought and help us plan next steps. I know there are several members of the work group here. I think they're still here. If you'd like to have them come up and speak to you and tell you about their experience and their thoughts on the recommendations, that would be great. And of course, we're welcome any questions you have.
Well, thank you for the presentation, and thank you, Sarah and others that here that may have participated. I know there was a lot of work that's gone into this. Affordable housing, workforce housing has been, a key goal for us to try to establish. And I think, when I scanned through these 13 suggestions, I think they all have merits. Some have consequences. They all have some form of consequences, but I think they all bring great opportunity, and certainly would like to explore each of them in their own component as we move forward in this discussion. It's one of the questions I have, and maybe it's just a general thought. When we think about housing, providing housing, we can't just look at our 9 square miles of the city. And I know James City County is undergoing some efforts to try to work towards building affordable housing and helping people age in place and that type of thing. Have we merged these conversations to see if there's an opportunity to work towards a common goal?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really great question. I wish it had an easy answer. It doesn't. It's interesting that this has come up now because I was just at the regional chief administrative officers meeting last week, and one of the localities in the regional planning district has suggested that the HRPDC should work on regional solutions to affordable housing. And during that discussion, the CAOs identified all of the problems that seemingly great idea brings to the table, right? So because the concept of affordable housing is so different from locality to locality to locality, even in terms of what Williamsburg needs and wants versus what James City County needs and wants are significantly different, just given the makeup of our localities. And so it's hard to have a one-size-fits-all or even a one-size-fits-many solution. What I suggested to the group is that the HRPDC, if they are going to pursue a regional solution, especially a large regional solution, is maybe their role is to just do what we did in that first step of the work group, which is to identify best practices in terms of a menu of strategies that have worked in similar localities that other localities could choose from to apply to their problem. That way, there's no pressure necessarily to perform or approve certain projects that maybe don't fit with your locality. Everybody can choose to do what they want. In specific to this report, the idea of working regionally was critical to the work group, and we talked about it numerous times. In fact, one draft of this included on the recommendations page, each one of those had an entire section devoted to how does this work in a regional application. Ultimately, we just decided that that concept was so difficult, given the political realities of York County and James City County and Williamsburg and how different we are in that we simplified that down to be this regional statement in the final thoughts page, which is obviously many of these strategies we've identified could be amplified and work better in some cases, community land trust being one of those models, if they were regional. Certainly they would be better funded and we'd have more space to play with. If you look at those needs, the needs assessment that was done, clearly Williamsburg alone cannot satisfy those needs.
And so just another, and again, I like all these concepts as concepts and look forward to having more conversations about the nuances of each of them. But another two prevailing terms that come to mind when I think about housing opportunities that are inhibitants to Williamsburg, again in our 9 square miles, is height restrictions and density restrictions. I think it wouldn't be prudent to try to have sprawling neighborhoods that provide minimum houses, and so part of this consideration has to be looking at our own zoning ordinances to allow for some taller buildings in the right places and higher density in the right places. And so how that all fits in here is a component of it. And even when you look at conversion of hotels, density is going to be an issue. So as we look at available land, how do we make sure that we, look at the blatant area? Clearly, if there was an opportunity to go higher, we could get more housing inventory in that area, and I think that would be a desired outcome. So, Mr. Vice Mayor, if you don't mind, these two served on the committee. Would you mind if I go this way first?
Not at all.
Well, having served on the committee, I don't have any questions because we sort of lived it and breathed it. And I do want to thank the members of the committee. I see Sarah and Carol and Vaughn who came, and Wendy and Tyrone who are here in support of the presentation. I really thank them for their input, their suggestions. I think we sort of talked about a lot of different things and came up with some good ideas. And having served on the Neighborhood Balance Committee, I see how some of the focus topics that we came up here could also help with neighborhood balance when implemented. And would like to just remember that affordable housing is one of the approved uses of ARPA money, as I understand it. So there might be some opportunities for us to utilize or to implement some of these plans sooner rather than later. So nothing else to add.
Thank you. Mr. Rogers?
I too certainly appreciated the ability to serve on the Affordable Housing Task Force, and thank you for all of the other members that came here today. It's good to see a couple of you all for the first time in person. Right. I'll echo what Councilman Ramsey said in how many ideas we were initially considering. I said it was at one point over 80, and how we really pared it down to these 13. And before going to other members of council, maybe a discussion, I'll note that these 13, despite being categorized as a top 5, and I'm excited about these top 5, that's not to say that the other 8 are unviable. And I think one of the things that the group considered in our 2 voting periods is not to vote for the top 5 being just the lowest hanging fruit, but what are some that could be addressed quickly, and then some, such as a triangle redevelopment, that might have a real impact but take longer to do. In saying that, there could be some low-hanging fruit to be considered in the 6th through 13th recommendations that we might also look at. So very much appreciate the ability to serve and help represent council on the task force, and I'm looking forward to discussing these today and hearing back from staff, and I'm sure considering the issue continuously.
So I also echo all the comments from fellow council members, and thanks to all the committee members for their work on this initiative, because it is very important to the city of Williamsburg. You know, and has already been stated, I think all the initiatives have merit. Mr. Trivette, I do like the format of the report in that we get the 5 recommendations that we could focus on, again, not discounting the others. So I think that gives us the input from the group, and then gives us the top 5 to consider as we move forward. And obviously, each of them, as you've outlined in your presentation, have advantages, and there's some significant challenges to many of them. Obviously, funding always comes up as a significant challenge. So, and as Councilwoman Ramsey pointed out, ARPA money is available to maybe assist with some of those challenges. So I look forward to more discussion, and I'm sure I'll have more specific questions as we move forward, but very pleased with the outcome of the report, and thanks again to everyone for their hard work in this effort.
Yeah, I'd like to reiterate thanks to staff and the committee members. 3 areas of discussion. The first one, I think it would be helpful to City Council if when we look at the top 10 or even the top 13, that we have a little more information in terms of, you know, maybe it's ranges of city investment required for each, staff time involved, especially the first year. And then maybe, because we know that one of the limitations for doing these projects is limited staff. And maybe on some of them, it would be beneficial to note, you know, which projects were where we could bring in additional staff resources during the planning phase to start the projects, rather than because of lack of staff, we're not starting a, you know, long-term project now. On workforce housing, I really like the idea of looking to use seed money, and maybe it's ARPA funds, for a prototype where we could actually develop a cost-effective, and I would recommend, you know, a passive house, which would help with our green initiative. And one of the things, because I don't know that we've got many examples of passive houses in Williamsburg, a couple of the things you would see in a passive house, it would be designed and built to maintain a comfortable climate without active heating and cooling systems. You'd see heavy insulation and no thermal bridges. In other words, there'd be efficient windows and doors and detailing. There'd be airtight construction, which will keep, in our climate, keep the humidity outside. And then ventilation for bringing filtered fresh air inside, and the use of heat exchangers there. And then finally, passive solar gains. So being able to design and detail something like that and put it, you know, as a prototype as the beginning of this project, I think would be helpful. The other initiative I think that would be helpful is the accessory dwelling units. And that's a way to add units within single-family neighborhoods, which in many cities, the single-family neighborhoods typically account for about 75% of the area. Is that reasonable for Williamsburg in terms of our single-family zones?
I would say the single-family zones are the greater part of our residential area, yes.
Right. And this could be a voluntary program that could contribute to neighborhood stability in 2 ways. One, it would require the owner to live on the property. And 2, instead of our current single-family zones which allow 3 unrelated individuals in a house, there'd really be 2. Now I came across this weekend this magazine. It's put out by the National Association of Realtors, and it's called On Common Ground. And the article was the evolving form of housing. And there are just a couple things that I thought were pertinent here. It said, urban planners like ADUs because they contribute to the goal of increasing density in single-family residential neighborhoods and promote infill development. And there was one architect that said, ADU owners use the buildings for different purposes at different stages of their lives. Lots of young people who have a big house have built an ADU. They live in the ADU and rent the big house. When they have kids, they switch and they rent out the ADU and live in the big house. As they get old, they can switch again when they no longer need to live in the big house. So one of the things we've heard from Neighborhood Balance was the high turnover in some of our neighborhoods. This is an example where you could be living on the same property for, most of your life. There was a comment here from the director of livability for our AARP, said that by 2035, we're going to have more people over age of 65 than under age of 18. He said the trend more and more is for cities to open up to ADUs. He said that they're starting to understand that many cities have affordability crisis. There are people living there who want to stay there, and they're having a hard time. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think all those are good points. So I think next step, so we're obviously going to accept this report, and I don't know if anybody had any more comments and wanted to break down any of these concepts further for discussion, but I think we should accept the report, kind of lean on staff to vet some of these issues and come back to council, again, with some conversations with us, maybe at another meeting or work session, to kind of identify, after we've had time to digest it a little bit more, what we think are good targets, but more importantly, I think how we can take some of these and incorporate it into our next GIO session, or if it needs to be a comp plan update. So I think there's lots of opportunities here, and I think over the next year we should dig into them, in a great more detail.
So let me just ask kind of what you're getting at there, so I know when we might see it back in front of us. Is that then to take the to use the hotel conversion and figure out how can we Williamsburgize that, as in how many would that be in Williamsburg, or for inclusionary zoning, what would the policy be here? Is that essentially what you're saying for these initiatives? Yeah, and by way of example, I know you and I talked about just hotel inventory conversation today. I think it's a model that works. I think if staff has already identified some, I think they should come back, look at what that zoning change would look like and how we can implement that. I think that should be something we address pretty quickly. Knowing that one and a couple others maybe would take a more a text change. For instance, the mixed use, I think, was an implementation in 90 days, but the real impact 10 years. Is there a way that we could prioritize some of the low-hanging fruit ones to come back sooner, whereas obviously we might not see the plan for the triangle redevelopment until the next GIO cycle or something that's a bit farther away?
Sure, and the Triangle Redevelopment Project is one that has been incorporated in so much of our discussion, not just the affordable housing. So that's a project that's going to move forward based on your other previous decisions. I think that, I guess my suggestion would be that you take the mayor's advice, which is take this report, think about it a little bit more. We will go and put some more additional thought into what our recommendations would be to use the affordable housing conversion, hotel to affordable housing conversion item, put some more of our thoughts together about what might need to change in that ordinance to make it more effective, because we do have some strong ideas about that. And we can bring those back to you over time. As I said, we're going to have plenty of opportunities to talk about next steps. We're going to do the midterm report very soon. It'll be another chance to talk about where we go from here. And then, I know thinking in terms of another year seems like we're putting things off, but it'll be here before you know it, the next year, and we'll be doing the GIO discussion again. And as we do that, the thought being that we're going to take items that were in the neighborhood balance report, items that were in the affordable housing report, items that are in all of the committee work that we've been doing, and decide what's next in that GIO horizon of 2 years.
Sure. Yeah, well, and some of these that would actually take a building, we might not, let's say we use some ARPA money for
Sure.
the Wall Memorial Park build out. We might not literally have that money for a little while. So that makes sense. I just want to make sure, obviously there's a need to really have Williamsburg version of some of these come back, and that's not a process that just happens overnight.
Right.
Would it be in the first quarter of 2022 that we might be able to reconsider some of these ideas? Because I want to make sure that at least the ones that are more of the, the 90-day implementation, that we wouldn't push them out needlessly too far.
So the wrinkle in being able to answer that is the fact that our esteemed planning director is leaving us. And so it's very difficult to estimate how long it might be before we can come back to you with a recommendation, because our focus in the first quarter will be hiring a new planning director.
Maybe there could be an encore until we bring them back to council.
I think she's right now doing the math on how expensive her consulting fee would be.
I think right now what's going through her mind is she'd rather be at home.
That's right. Exactly.
Rather be in Italy.
But, even you look at the mixed income, mixed use plan, there's a lot of zoning, questions there and density and those types of things that have to be factored into that. And so that's what staff is going to have to start breaking down. I think it's a great idea. I think, having people live above places to work is,
Sure.
it's a great thing. And we don't do enough of that in the city of Williamsburg. I say city because we are a city and we shouldn't be afraid of density and height. To a certain degree, so.
Well, and that one in particular needs to work in conjunction with the streetscape plans that will be taking place on Capitol Landing Road as well.
Okay.
Yeah, that's all for me. I think just the expediency, understanding that there may be some other things to get through. Would be nice to see some of them, particularly those that there may be more a code change come back sooner.
I know we have the city manager's cell phone, so we can bug them anytime we need to.
That's right.
It's not on the 15th.
whiteboard now. I'm gonna write it on there.
Okay, any other questions or comments? All right. So that takes us to city council communications. Does anybody have anything they'd like to report in on? Seeing none, we'll move to scheduled meetings. Mr. Trivette, you got a lot on there.
So we changed up. Sandy had the brilliant idea of, rather than me
Thank you,
giving
Sandy.
a verbal report every month, maybe we should just print it on the agenda. So there they are.
Good.
The only thing is the EDA meeting, I believe, has been canceled for November. So,
I think
Yes.
they
Yuri
did,
is nodding. That is correct.
right.
because we're moving our city council meeting to Wednesday, the 10th, because the city will be closed on Thursday, the 11th of Veterans Day. So if you show up Thursday, you won't see us. Okay, so that takes us now to open forum. If there's anybody else who'd like to come forward to speak, please do. Always look forward to hearing from our citizens. Seeing none, we'll close the open forum, and I think we have an item for closed session.
We do. I move to go into closed session pursuant to section 2.2-3711 of the Code of Virginia for the purpose of discussing one personnel matter per subparagraph 1 concerning appointments to boards and commissions.
Second.
Mr. Rogers?
Aye.
Ms. Ramsey?
Aye.
Mayor Pons?
Aye.
Vice Mayor Dent?
Aye.
Mr. Maslin?
Aye.
Okay, so we will go into closed session and return shortly.